Feedback Learnex, English forever.
Welcome to this week's edition of Feedback Learnex, where we're going to travel and take a look at music through time. Without wishing to make a nostalgic post beefing up past decades, the 50s and 60s were one of the most decisive stages for the world of music, with the creation and evolution of musical styles which are the pillars of different currents that we have grown to know and love today. Rock music, for example, originated in the 1950s. This style is the result of the fusion of other American genres, such as blues, gospel, jazz, and also with influences from the primitive hillbilly, which is the ancestor of country music. One of the pioneers of rock would be Roy Brown, who in 1947 made one of the first songs which would be included within this genre, Good Rockin' Tonight, which would later be covered by artists such as Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. Another genre that emerged in the late 50s was soul, whose origins can be found above all in gospel, religious music of the African American community, which would evolve towards its secularization, giving rise to this genre. Soul, unlike rock or country, began as exclusive to black artists. Another particularly important style, which was consolidated in the 1950s, was country. Its history began in the 1920s, and its origin dates back to the fusion of music brought by European immigrants, especially those from Ireland. Rock, soul, and country are heavily influenced by African American music. Blues and gospel came from Afro-American settlers who were slaves brought from Africa to work in fields. The music of the 70s and 80s paved the way for new talents. Broadly speaking, rock music in the 70s began in a tragic way, with the deaths of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, two symbols of the 60s generation, both dying from drug overdoses. Musically, the hippie and psychedelic experimentation of the 60s gave way to a genre with much more pompous and convoluted songs, symphonic rock. The exponents of the 70s are Yes, Genesis, Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple. Glam rock and the androgynous attitude of talents like David Bowie and T-Rex were to delight thousands of fans. And here began a much more theatrical staging, showing that rock, in addition to chords, was a comprehensive show. Thus, Alice Cooper and Kiss took over the best shows of their time, and then they would be an influence for many bands to come. Starting in the second half of the decade, a genre from the suburbs of New York burst into the circulation, that quota of rebellion that rock and the music of the 70s had lost. We're talking about punk. Its main players were the Ramones in the United States, and in England, the Sex Pistols and the Clash. Pop and heavy metal are perhaps the genres that are most developed, or that in fact are established as the music that will mark an entire generation, and in fact names like Michael Jackson or Madonna are still currently among the most popular. Among the greats of music in the 1980s are Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, Elton John, The Police, and Duran Duran. There were also room for the dark movement and techno-pop with names such as The Cure, Depeche Mode, Erasure, Pet Shop Boys. Meanwhile, a band from this decade was later to become the most important in the world, U2. The last of the massive musical movements of the 80s was hard rock, a lighter version of heavy that almost bordered on pop music. Groups like Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, or Poison sold millions of records with a proposal that was accompanied by the pretty faces of its members to the delirium of teenage girls. In parallel, others like Guns N' Roses and Metallica were vying for the heavy throne towards the end of the 80s. In broad strokes, this was the panorama of the musical movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. That dominated the international market. Already in the 90s, with the avant-garde, grunge, Another was going to be the story, but that is one for the next one. Thanks for tuning in to this week's edition of Feedback Learnex. See you all next week, Thursday night at 9:15 p.m.
Feedback Learnex. English Forever. Estamos en sintonía. Feedback Learnex. English Forever. Feedback Learnex. It's learning.